What happens when a former royal walks into one of television's most respected news programs, expecting the red carpet treatment, only to discover that hard-hitting journalism doesn't bow to titles or fame? It only took 37 seconds for a single comment about hurricane victims to ignite the most explosive television meltdown in recent memory, turning what should have been a routine interview into a career-ending catastrophe that left viewers across America shocked and speechless. Anderson Cooper sat behind his pristine desk, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression calm and professional as always. The studio lights cast their familiar warm glow across the set of Anderson Cooper 360, creating that intimate atmosphere that had made him one of the most trusted voices in news. Tonight was supposed to be different, though. Tonight, he had a guest who rarely granted interviews, someone who commanded attention wherever she went. Meghan Markle entered the studio with the confidence of someone who had spent years in the spotlight. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she made her way to the guest chair, her designer dress flowing behind her like she was walking a red carpet. She settled into the chair across from Anderson, crossing her legs elegantly and flashing that practiced smile that had charmed millions around the world. Anderson looked up from his notes, offering his own warm smile. "Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I know you don't do many interviews these days, so we appreciate you taking the time." Meghan tilted her head slightly, her smile widening. "Well, Anderson, I felt it was important to speak directly to the American people about some very important issues. There are things that need to be said, truths that need to be told." The seasoned journalist nodded, his pen poised over his notepad. "I understand you want to discuss your charitable work, particularly your recent involvement with disaster relief efforts. Can you tell us about that?" Meghan straightened in her chair, her eyes lighting up with what seemed like genuine passion. "Absolutely. You know, when I see the devastation caused by these natural disasters, my heart just breaks. As someone who has experienced real suffering myself, I feel a deep connection to these victims." Anderson's eyebrows raised slightly at the comparison, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "You mentioned real suffering. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that?" Meghan's expression grew serious, her voice taking on a more dramatic tone. "Anderson, the media scrutiny I faced, the isolation, the feeling of being trapped within an institution that didn't understand me or support me, that was its own kind of natural disaster. The emotional hurricane I weathered was just as devastating as anything these people are going through." The silence in the studio was deafening. Anderson's pen had stopped moving. His cameraman shifted uncomfortably behind his equipment. Even the usually bustling production crew had gone completely still, as if they couldn't quite believe what they had just heard. Anderson cleared his throat, his voice measured and careful. "I want to make sure I understand correctly. Are you comparing your experience with negative press coverage to the experiences of people who have lost their homes, their possessions, and in some cases, family members to actual hurricanes?" Meghan's composure began to crack slightly, her smile becoming more forced. "I think you're oversimplifying what I went through, Anderson. The psychological trauma of being targeted by an entire institution, of having lies spread about you daily, of feeling like you have no way to defend yourself, that creates its own kind of devastation." But the veteran journalist wasn't backing down. He had covered actual disasters, had stood in the wreckage of communities torn apart by nature's fury, had interviewed families who had lost everything they owned and everyone they loved. "Miss Markle, I've reported from the scenes of Category 5 hurricanes. I've spoken with mothers who watched their children swept away by floodwaters, with fathers who lost their entire families when their homes collapsed. How do you reconcile comparing media coverage to that level of human suffering?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Meghan's perfectly composed facade began to show cracks, her voice taking on an edge that hadn't been there moments before. "I think you're being incredibly insensitive to mental health struggles, Anderson. Just because my pain doesn't look the same as someone else's doesn't make it less valid." Anderson leaned forward slightly, his journalist instincts fully engaged now. "I'm not questioning the validity of mental health struggles. What I'm questioning is the appropriateness of comparing personal difficulties with press coverage to the life and death situations faced by natural disaster victims. Don't you think that comparison might be offensive to people who have actually lost everything?" Meghan's carefully crafted public persona was starting to slip away entirely. Her voice rose slightly, though she was clearly trying to maintain control. "You know what, Anderson? I'm starting to see why you work alone. This kind of attack journalism is exactly the problem with media today." The comment hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Anderson's expression didn't change, but there was something different in his eyes now, a sharpness that suggested the professional journalist was fully awake and engaged. Attack journalism? I asked you to clarify a comparison you made. That's called journalism. But Meghan was just getting started, and what came next would turn this interview from uncomfortable to completely explosive. Meghan's eyes flashed with something dangerous as she leaned forward in her chair. You want to talk about suffering, Anderson? Let me tell you about real suffering. Real suffering is being the most Googled woman in the world and having every single article written about you be negative. Real suffering is having your own father sell stories about you to tabloids. Real suffering is marrying into a family that promised to protect you and then threw you to the wolves. Anderson remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. The camera operators were getting footage they knew would be replayed for years. This wasn't just an interview anymore. This was a meltdown happening in real time on live television. Miss Markle, I understand you face challenges, Anderson said, his voice remaining calm and measured. But we were discussing your comparison between media coverage and natural disasters that have killed thousands of people. Do you stand by that comparison? Meghan's composure was unraveling thread by thread. Her voice grew sharper, more defiant. You know what your problem is, Anderson? You sit in your ivory tower of journalism thinking you're so much better than everyone else. You've never been hunted by paparazzi. You've never had your every move scrutinized and criticized. You've never had to smile and wave while people destroy your reputation behind your back. The veteran newsman had covered wars, interviewed dictators, and faced down some of the most powerful people in the world. He wasn't about to be intimidated now. I've actually covered wars and natural disasters where people have died, he replied quietly. I've interviewed refugees who fled genocide, families who lost children in school shootings, survivors of terrorist attacks. I think I have some perspective on what real suffering looks like. That was the match that lit the fuse. Meghan's carefully constructed public image exploded in spectacular fashion. She shot up from her chair, her designer dress swirling around her as she stood towering over the seated journalist. How dare you, she shouted, her voice echoing through the studio. How dare you sit there and minimize what I went through? You have no idea what it's like to be me. You have no idea what it's like to be a strong, independent woman of color being torn down by jealous, bitter people who can't stand to see someone succeed. Anderson didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, didn't show any emotion at all. His decades of experience had taught him that the best response to someone losing control was to remain completely in control yourself. Miss Markle, please sit down. We can continue this conversation civilly, but civility was the last thing on Meghan's mind now. She began pacing behind her chair like a caged animal, her hands gesturing wildly as she spoke. Civil? You want to talk about civil? There was nothing civil about the way I was treated. There was nothing civil about the racist headlines. There was nothing civil about being abandoned by the very institution that was supposed to protect me. Anderson's voice remained steady, professional, almost maddeningly calm. I'm not defending any inappropriate coverage you may have received, but you came on this program and compared your media experience to hurricane victims. I'm simply asking you to explain that comparison. Meghan whirled around to face him, her eyes blazing. You know what, Anderson? Maybe those hurricane victims should be grateful that people actually care about their suffering. At least when their homes get destroyed, people send help. When my life got destroyed, people just laughed and said I deserved it. The silence that followed was so complete, you could have heard a pin drop. Even the usually busy production crew had stopped all movement, frozen in disbelief at what they were witnessing. Anderson's cameraman kept rolling, knowing he was capturing television history in the making. Anderson slowly removed his reading glasses and set them on his desk. The gesture was small, but it somehow made him seem more formidable, not less. Miss Markle, he said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the studio pay attention. I need you to listen to yourself right now. You just suggested that people who lost their homes and family members in natural disasters should be grateful for the attention their suffering receives. But Meghan was beyond listening to reason now. She was caught up in her own fury, her own sense of victimhood, her own belief that the entire world had conspired against her. Don't you dare lecture me, she snapped. Don't you dare sit there in your privileged position and judge me. You have no idea what I've sacrificed, what I've given up, what I've lost. Anderson stood up slowly, his full height now matching hers across the desk. The movement was deliberate, controlled, and somehow more intimidating than any shouting could have been. What exactly have you lost, Miss Markle? Your title? Your wealth? Your platform? Your ability to speak to millions of people whenever you choose? The question hit like a physical blow. Meghan's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time since her outburst began, She seemed to realize how she was coming across, how her words were being received. But it was too late. The damage was done, and Anderson Cooper was about to deliver the final blow that would end this interview once and for all. Anderson's question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Meghan stood frozen, her mouth still open, her eyes darting around the studio as if looking for an escape route that didn't exist. The camera captured every micro-expression, every moment of her dawning realization that she had crossed a line there was no coming back from. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Anderson remained standing, his expression unchanged, waiting for an answer that wasn't going to come. Finally, he spoke again, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades holding powerful people accountable. "Let me help you with that answer," he said quietly. "You haven't lost your freedom. You haven't lost your safety. You haven't lost your family to violence or natural disaster. You haven't lost your home to floods or your livelihood to circumstances beyond your control. What you've lost is some positive press coverage." Meghan's face flushed red, but her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "You don't understand." Anderson picked up his glasses from the desk and put them back on, a simple gesture that somehow restored all his professional authority. "You're right. I don't understand. I don't understand how someone with your platform, your resources, and your opportunities can sit in front of a camera and compare negative news coverage to natural disasters that have killed thousands of innocent people." Something snapped inside Meghan at those words. All pretense of control vanished completely. "You sanctimonious, arrogant man!" she screamed, her voice cracking with fury. "You think you're so perfect? You think you're so much better than everyone else? Well, let me tell you something about your precious journalism career." Anderson raised one hand slightly, a gesture so small it was almost imperceptible, but it carried enough authority to stop her mid-sentence. "Miss Markle, this interview is over." The words were said so quietly, so calmly, that they seemed to echo louder than all of Meghan's shouting combined. She stared at him in shock, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice still shaking with anger. Anderson was already gathering his notes, his movements deliberate and professional. "I said this interview is over. I will not provide a platform for someone to minimize the suffering of disaster victims or to attack the very people whose job it is to hold public figures accountable." But Meghan wasn't done fighting. She moved around the desk, getting closer to Anderson, her voice rising to a shout again. "You can't just end this. I have things to say. I have a voice and you can't silence me." Anderson looked up from his papers, his expression completely calm. "You absolutely have a voice, Miss Markle, but you don't have a right to use my program to spread comparisons between media coverage and human tragedy. Security will escort you out." The word security seemed to hit Meghan like a physical blow. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "Security? You're having me removed by security? Do you have any idea who I am?" Anderson's response was delivered with the kind of quiet dignity that had made him one of the most respected journalists in America. "Yes, I know exactly who you are. You're someone who just compared your experience with negative press to the suffering of hurricane victims, and then doubled down when given the opportunity to clarify. That's exactly who you are." Two security guards appeared at the edge of the studio, their presence professional but unmistakable. Meghan looked from them to Anderson and back again, her face cycling through emotions like a broken kaleidoscope. Anger, disbelief, embarrassment, and finally, desperate defiance. "This is unbelievable," she shouted as the security guards approached. "This is exactly the kind of treatment I was talking about. This is exactly why I had to speak out." Anderson had returned to his seat and was calmly reviewing his notes for the next segment. Without looking up, he spoke one final time. "Miss Markle, comparing media scrutiny to natural disasters that kill people isn't speaking out. It's speaking down to the very real suffering of others. Goodbye." The security guards positioned themselves on either side of Meghan, their presence gentle but firm. "Ma'am," one of them said quietly, "we need to escort you from the building." For a moment, it seemed like Meghan might resist, might create an even bigger scene, but something in Anderson's complete dismissal of her, his return to business as usual, seemed to deflate her entirely. The fight went out of her all at once, leaving behind someone who suddenly looked very small despite her designer clothes and carefully styled appearance. "Fine," she said, her voice barely audible now. "Fine. But this isn't over, Anderson. People need to know the truth about what really happened to me." Anderson didn't look up from his papers. "The truth is, what just happened here," he said simply. And 30 million people just watched it. As the security guards led her toward the exit, Meghan made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers," she called over her shoulder. Anderson finally looked up, and for the first time since the interview began, he allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "I look forward to it," he said. The studio doors closed behind Meghan with a soft click that sounded like a gavel falling. Anderson straightened his tie, looked directly into the camera, and delivered the kind of closing statement that reminded everyone why he had become one of the most trusted voices in journalism. "We'll be right back," he said, his voice steady and professional, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened at all.